They were told Americans would rape them, torture them, parade them through the streets as trophies of war. But when 47 Japanese women stepped into the medical ward at Fort McClellan, Alabama, in September 1945, the enemy broke them not with violence, but with something they never expected. A dying woman lay on the floor, her breath shallow, her body burning with fever. The American doctor didn't spit on her. He didn't laugh. He lifted her onto the examination table with his own hands as though she mattered, as though her life had value. They expected cruelty. They received care. And in that moment, everything they had been taught began to crumble. If this story moves you, make sure to like this video and subscribe for more incredible true accounts from World War II. These histories deserve to be remembered. The summer heat hung thick over the Pacific Islands in August 1945. News of Japan's surrender spread through military installations like wildfire, carried on radio waves and whispered conversations. For the American soldiers stationed across the Pacific Theater, it meant the beginning of the end. For the Japanese women scattered across occupied territories, it meant the beginning of something unknown and terrifying. In Saipan, in the Philippines, in occupied China, Japanese women who had served the Imperial Army as nurses, clerks, comfort station workers, and support staff found themselves suddenly without protection. The empire that had sent them thousands of miles from home had collapsed. The soldiers who had promised to defend them had surrendered or died. Now they stood in small groups, exhausted, terrified, waiting to learn their fate. The women wore whatever remained of their clothing. Some still had pieces of their uniforms, the white blouses and dark skirts of nursing auxiliaries, now stained and torn. Others wore simple cotton dresses, patched and repatched until the original fabric was barely visible. Their hair, once carefully maintained according to military regulations, now hung loose or was tied back with strips of cloth. Many were barefoot. Their shoes had worn through months ago. Among them was Keiko, 23 years old, formerly a clerk at a supply depot in Manila. She stood with her arms wrapped around herself, despite the heat, trying to make herself as small as possible. Next to her was Yuki, a former nurse who had tended wounded soldiers in field hospitals until the final retreat. Yuki's hands still bore the scars of working without proper equipment, burns from sterilizing instruments over open flames, cuts from broken glass used as surgical tools when metal ran out. There was also Hana, barely 19, who had been taken from her village in Korea and sent to work in a comfort station. She stood apart from the others, her eyes fixed on the ground, silent. The other women knew better than to speak to her. The shame ran too deep for words. The American soldiers who came to collect them were not what the women expected. There was no violence, no brutality. The soldiers were efficient, businesslike, almost bored. They lined the women up, counted them, checked their names against lists on clipboards. The women kept their eyes down, shoulders hunched, waiting for the first blow that never came. "Move it, let's go," one soldier said, gesturing toward the trucks. His tone was neither kind nor cruel. It was simply the voice of a man doing his job, ready to go home. The women climbed into the backs of military trucks, their bodies pressed together as they tried to make themselves small. The canvas covers blocked out most of the sunlight, leaving them in hot, dim shadow. As the engine started and the trucks began to move, some of the women closed their eyes and prayed. Others simply stared straight ahead, their minds blank with fear and exhaustion. The journey to the collection point took hours. The trucks bounced along rough roads, past burned villages and abandoned military positions. Through the gaps in the canvas, the women caught glimpses of the destruction. Palm trees blown to splinters, buildings reduced to concrete foundations, craters where bombs had fallen. At the port, they were transferred to ships. The women moved in silent lines down the dock, their bare feet slapping against hot wood. American sailors watched them with expressions ranging from curiosity to contempt to something that might have been pity. The women kept their eyes down. The ships were massive, larger than anything most of the women had seen. The hulls rose like steel cliffs above the water. Inside, they were directed down narrow corridors to holding areas deep in the ship. The air was thick with the smell of metal, oil, and bodies. The women were given thin mattresses and told to wait. As the ship's engines rumbled to life and the vessel began to move, the women huddled together in small groups. Some whispered prayers, others cried quietly. A few, like Keiko, sat in stunned silence, trying to process what was happening. "They will kill us at sea," whispered one woman, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "They will throw us overboard when no one can see." "No," another replied. "They will take us to America and put us in cages, display us like animals." Yuki the nurse said nothing. She had seen too much death to speculate about her own. Whatever came would come. She focused on breathing, on staying present, on not letting her mind spiral into the dark places it wanted to go. The voyage lasted 3 weeks. The women were given 2 meals a day, simple rations of rice, canned vegetables, and sometimes a piece of bread. It was more food than many of them had seen in months. At first, some refused to eat, convinced it was poisoned or a trick. But hunger eventually won. They ate slowly, cautiously, waiting for symptoms that never came. During the day, they were occasionally allowed on deck for fresh air, always under guard. The ocean stretched endlessly in all directions, beautiful and terrifying. Some women stood at the rail and looked back toward the horizon, toward Japan, knowing they might never see their homeland again. Keiko kept a small notebook, stolen from an abandoned office in Manila. In it, she wrote brief entries, trying to document what was happening. Her handwriting was small and careful, each character formed precisely despite the ship's movement. Day 8. We are still alive. The Americans feed us. I do not understand why. Yuki says we should not question it, just accept. But I cannot stop thinking about what comes next. What do they want from us? When they finally saw land, it was like nothing they had imagined. The California coast appeared through the morning fog, and as the ship drew closer, the women crowded at the portholes and railings to look. Buildings rose in neat rows, untouched by war. Streets were intact. Cars moved along roads. Everything was whole, functioning, alive. It's as if the war never touched them, Keiko whispered, her voice filled with something between awe and resentment. The ship docked at San Francisco. The women were processed through immigration in a large warehouse at the port. American officials sat at long tables, stamping papers, asking questions through translators. The women answered in monosyllables, their voices barely audible. From San Francisco, they were loaded onto trains. This was perhaps the strangest part of the journey so far. The trains were clean, with cushioned seats and windows that opened. The women sat stiffly, afraid to touch anything, convinced this comfort was somehow a trap. The train traveled east for days. Through the windows, the women watched America roll past. Mountains gave way to deserts, then plains, then forests. They saw towns and cities, farms and factories, all untouched by bombs. The contrast with their memories of Japan's burned cities was overwhelming. How can this be real? One woman whispered. How can any country be this big, this whole? Yuki stared out the window, her medical mind cataloging what she saw. Clean streets, healthy children playing, buildings with intact roofs. She thought of the field hospital she had worked in, where they amputated limbs without anesthesia and prayed that infection wouldn't kill the patient before blood loss did. She thought of the families huddled in bomb shelters, eating grass and bark to survive. And here was the enemy, living in abundance. The train finally stopped at a small station in Alabama. The heat hit them like a physical force when they stepped onto the platform. It was different from Pacific heat, drier, heavier somehow. Buses waited to take them the final distance to Fort McClellan. The fort appeared through the bus windows as they approached. Guard towers stood at intervals along the fence. Barracks stretched in orderly rows. American soldiers moved about their duties. It looked like a military installation anywhere in the world, functional and austere. But it was not what they had been told to expect. There were no cages. No crowds of jeering civilians. No public displays of humiliation. Just buildings and fences and soldiers doing their jobs. The buses stopped at an administrative building. The women were lined up outside, told to wait. An American officer emerged, flanked by a translator. "You will be processed," the translator said in Japanese. "You will be given quarters, uniforms, and assignments. You will work while you are here. You will be treated according to the Geneva Convention. Do you understand?" The women nodded, not understanding most of what was said, only catching the words work and treated. Work they could understand. Treatment was still a mystery. As they stood in the Alabama heat, waiting to learn what would happen next, Keiko felt something shift inside her. Not hope exactly. She had learned not to hope. But a small crack in the wall of certainty. A tiny space where possibility might exist. They had expected to die. They had prepared themselves for the worst imaginable horrors. And yet here they stood, alive, being spoken to with bureaucratic indifference rather than rage. What did it mean? The first stop was the medical building. The women were lined up outside a long, low structure painted white. The door was propped open, and they could see nurses moving inside in crisp white uniforms. The sight made Yuki's heart clench. She had been a nurse once, in another life. One by one, they were called inside. The examination room was clean, almost sterile. Medical equipment lined the walls, instruments that gleamed under bright lights. An American doctor waited, along with 2 nurses and the translator. When Keiko's turn came, she walked into the room with her arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the floor. The doctor was an older man with gray hair and glasses. He gestured for her to sit on the examination table. "I need to check your vital signs," the translator explained. "The doctor needs to make sure you are healthy." Keiko sat rigidly as the doctor approached. She flinched when he reached out, but his touch was gentle, professional. He checked her pulse, listened to her breathing, looked at her eyes and throat. Throughout the examination, he maintained a calm, detached demeanor. He was neither cruel nor especially kind. He was simply a doctor doing his job. When he finished, he made notes on a clipboard and said something to the nurse. The translator turned to Keiko. "You are malnourished and dehydrated. You will be given supplements and a special diet to help you gain weight. Do you have any pain or injuries?" Keiko shook her head, unable to speak. The doctor nodded and gestured that she could go. As she left the room, she felt dizzy with confusion. He had touched her, examined her, and then let her go. No violence, no humiliation, just a medical examination. Outside, the other women waited anxiously for her report. "What did they do?" someone whispered. "They checked me," Keiko said slowly. "Like a doctor, just like a doctor." The women looked at each other, uncertain how to process this information. After the medical examinations, they were directed to another building. This one had a sign in English that none of them could read. Inside, they found rows of shower stalls and benches. The air was warm and humid, filled with the smell of soap. An American nurse, a woman in her 40s with a kind face, tried to explain through gestures what would happen. They would shower. They would be given soap and shampoo. Their old clothes would be taken and destroyed. They would be given new clothes. The women stood frozen. This was the moment they had been dreading. They would be forced to strip naked before their enemies, to stand vulnerable and exposed. This was where the humiliation would begin. But the nurse simply pointed to the showers and left, closing the door behind her. They were alone. Slowly, hesitantly, the women began to undress. They helped each other with buttons and ties, their movements mechanical, prepared for the worst. When they were naked, they stood huddled together, waiting. Nothing happened. Finally, Yuki stepped forward and turned on one of the showers. Water poured out, and after a moment, it ran hot. Steam began to rise. Yuki's eyes widened. Hot water. Running hot water. She stepped under the stream and gasped. For the first time in over a year, she felt hot water on her skin. She picked up the bar of soap from the shelf. It was white, unmarked, and it smelled clean. She turned it over in her hands, hardly believing it was real. One by one, the other women joined her. They stood under the showers, feeling months of dirt and grime wash away. Some began to cry, the water mixing with their tears. Others laughed, strange, high-pitched sounds that echoed off the tile walls. Keiko scrubbed her skin until it was red, trying to wash away more than just dirt. She worked the soap through her hair, watching the water at her feet turn gray, then gradually clearer. When she finally shut off the water and stood dripping on the tile floor, she felt lighter somehow, as if something heavy had been washed away along with the filth. Clean towels were stacked on shelves. The women dried themselves in silence, still waiting for the cruelty to begin. But there was only the sound of water dripping, the smell of soap, and the strange feeling of being clean. After showering, they were given simple cotton dresses to wear and directed to the mess hall. The building was large, with long tables and benches. The smell of cooking food hit them as soon as they entered, and several women stopped in the doorway, overwhelmed. American soldiers were eating at some of the tables. They glanced at the Japanese women with curiosity, but made no aggressive moves. The women were directed to a separate section of the hall, where trays had been set out. On each tray was more food than most of them had seen in months. White rice, steamed vegetables, a piece of chicken, a roll with butter, and a cup of something that looked like pudding. There was also a tall glass of milk. The women stood staring at the trays, unable to move. This had to be a trick, a test of some kind, or perhaps it was meant for someone else. "Sit, eat," an American soldier said, gesturing to the tables. His tone was not unkind, just matter-of-fact. Slowly, the women sat down. They picked up their forks with trembling hands. Keiko looked at her tray, then at Yuki, who sat across from her. Yuki nodded slightly, and they both took small bites. The rice was perfect, soft and white. The vegetables were cooked, but still had texture. The chicken was tender, seasoned with herbs they couldn't identify. It was real food, prepared with care, served hot. Some of the women began to cry as they ate. Others ate mechanically, their faces blank. A few couldn't eat at all, their throats closing with emotion. Yuki ate slowly, methodically, her medical training kicking in. Her body needed this food. She would eat even if her mind couldn't process what it meant. But as she swallowed each bite, questions swirled in her head. Why were they being fed like this? What did the Americans want? In Japan, she had treated wounded soldiers who were given nothing but rice gruel, when there was anything at all. Civilians had starved in the streets, children had died of malnutrition, and here the enemy was feeding their prisoners chicken and pudding. After the meal, they were taken to their barracks. The building was simple but clean, with rows of beds lined up along the walls. Each bed had a mattress, sheets, a pillow, and a thin blanket. At the foot of each bed was a small footlocker. An American officer, speaking through the translator, explained the rules. They would rise at 6 a.m. They would have breakfast at 7 a.m. They would be assigned work duties. They would have lunch at noon and dinner at 6 p.m. Lights out at 10 p.m. They were not to leave their designated areas without permission. They were to obey all orders from American personnel. The women listened in silence, trying to absorb this information. It sounded like military routine, structured and orderly. It did not sound like punishment. When the officer left, the women explored their new quarters cautiously. Keiko sat on her assigned bed and tested the mattress. It was thin but clean, softer than anything she had slept on in over a year. She touched the sheets, white cotton, slightly rough but whole. No tears, no patches. That night, lying in the dark barracks listening to the sounds of other women breathing, crying softly or whispering prayers, Keiko took out her notebook and wrote by the light from the window. They gave us food, hot water, clean beds. I do not understand. We were told they would torture us, rape us, kill us. Instead, they treat us like... I cannot finish this sentence. I do not know what to call this. It is not kindness. They are not our friends. But it is not cruelty either. What is happening here? She put the notebook away and lay down, pulling the blanket up to her chin. Outside, crickets sang in the Alabama night. Inside, the sound of quiet weeping gradually faded into exhausted silence. They had survived the first day. But survival was becoming more confusing than death might have been. The days began to follow a pattern. The wake-up bell rang at 6 a.m. sharp. The women rose from their beds, made them according to military standards they had learned in their previous lives, and filed to the washrooms. There were sinks with running water, toilets that flushed, and mirrors on the walls. Breakfast was served promptly at 7 a.m. Oatmeal, toast, sometimes eggs, always fruit and milk. The women ate in silence, still unable to reconcile the abundance with their expectations of captivity. After breakfast came work assignments. Some women were assigned to the kitchens, helping to prepare meals under the supervision of American cooks. Others went to the laundry, washing and folding linens. A few, including Yuki because of her medical background, were assigned to help in the camp hospital. Keiko was sent to work in the administrative offices, filing papers and sorting mail. It was quiet, repetitive work that gave her too much time to think. She worked alongside American clerks, who mostly ignored her, speaking to each other in English she couldn't understand. The work was not difficult. No one was cruel. The Americans gave instructions, expected them to be followed, and that was all. It was strangely anticlimactic. At lunchtime, they returned to the mess hall. More food, always more food than they could eat. Sandwiches, soup, fruit, cookies. The portions were generous, the quality good. Some women began to gain weight, their faces filling out, color returning to their cheeks. Afternoons meant more work, then a period of free time before dinner. During these hours, the women gathered in small groups in their barracks or outside in the yard, a fenced area where they were allowed to walk and talk. It was in these quiet moments that the real processing began. As the days turned into weeks, the cognitive dissonance grew stronger. The women had been taught all their lives about American brutality. They had heard stories of prisoners tortured, women violated, enemies shown no mercy. The propaganda had been relentless and specific, and yet day after day they were fed, clothed, given medical care, and treated with the casual indifference of military routine. No one beat them. No one starved them. No one raped them. The contradiction gnawed at them constantly. Maybe they are waiting, one woman whispered during their evening gathering. Maybe this is to make us trust them, and then the cruelty will begin. It has been 3 weeks, another replied. How long do they wait? Yuki listened to these conversations but said little. She was struggling with her own questions. In the hospital, she was allowed to assist with patient care. The American doctors and nurses treated her with professional courtesy. They showed her procedures, let her help with bandaging and medication distribution, even asked her opinion on some cases. It was almost like being a real nurse again, almost like having value. But at night, when she returned to the barracks, the guilt crashed over her like a wave. How could she feel satisfied by this work? How could she take pride in helping the enemy? What would her family think if they knew? Letters began to arrive from Japan, filtered through military censors. The women crowded around anyone who received mail, desperate for news from home. What they learned was devastating. Japan was in ruins. Cities had been reduced to ash. Hiroshima and Nagasaki were gone, wiped out by weapons beyond comprehension. Millions were homeless, starving, struggling to survive in the wreckage of the empire. One woman received a letter from her mother. We have nothing. The house is gone. Your father is sick, but there is no medicine. We eat once a day if we are lucky. I am glad you are alive, but I cannot imagine where you are or what has happened to you. Please come home if you can. The woman read this letter aloud to the others, her voice shaking. When she finished, silence filled the barracks. Then someone asked the question they were all thinking. How can we be here eating 3 meals a day, sleeping in clean beds while they starve? No one had an answer. Despite the overwhelming confusion, small moments began to accumulate. Moments that complicated the simple story of captivity and enemy. One morning, Keiko dropped a stack of files she was carrying in the office. Papers scattered across the floor. She dropped to her knees, frantically trying to gather them, expecting punishment. An American clerk knelt down beside her and helped, collecting papers without comment. When they stood up, the clerk gave her a small nod and went back to his desk. It was nothing. It was everything. In the hospital, Yuki watched an American doctor spend 30 minutes carefully setting the broken arm of a German prisoner, taking care to minimize pain, explaining each step even though the prisoner couldn't understand the words. The doctor's gentleness, his focus, his clear desire to heal rather than harm, it shook something loose in Yuki's chest. One evening during their outdoor time, a guard tossed a baseball to a group of women standing near the fence. They stared at it, confused. He made throwing motions, encouraging them to throw it back. Cautiously, one woman picked it up and tossed it toward him. He caught it and threw it back. A little game of catch that broke some invisible barrier. Soon several women were playing, laughing nervously at their own clumsiness. The guard smiled, patient, showing them how to throw. It lasted only a few minutes before he was called away, but those minutes lingered in their minds for days. Keiko wrote about it in her notebook. Today we played. I do not remember the last time I played anything. It felt wrong to laugh. It felt good to laugh. I do not know how to hold both truths at once. 6 weeks into their captivity, they learned about the canteen. It was a small store on the base where they could purchase items with camp scrip, tokens they earned for their work. The women were given a small allowance each week, and they could spend it on personal items. When they first entered the canteen, they stopped in the doorway, stunned. Shelves held chocolate bars, cigarettes, writing paper, pencils, toothpaste, soap, even small bottles of perfume. There were magazines, candies, needles and thread, hair ribbons. It was abundance beyond comprehension. Keiko stood before a shelf of chocolate bars, her hand hovering but not touching. In Japan, chocolate had become a distant memory, a luxury from before the war. Here were rows of it, available for purchase with tokens earned by sorting American mail. She bought one bar. That night she sat on her bed and unwrapped it slowly, savoring each square. The sweetness exploded on her tongue, rich and overwhelming. Tears ran down her face as she ate. She didn't know if she was crying from joy or shame or some emotion she had no name for. Around her, other women made similar discoveries. Chocolate, real soap that smelled like flowers, writing paper to send letters home, small luxuries that made them feel almost human again. But every purchase came with guilt. Every moment of pleasure was shadowed by the knowledge of suffering back home. The women existed in a constant state of tension, grateful and ashamed in equal measure. "We are prisoners who live better than we ever did when we were free," Yuki said one night, her voice hollow. "What does that make us?" No one answered. The question was too big, too painful, and the answer seemed to change with every passing day. 2 months into captivity, the internal struggles became impossible to ignore. The women had settled into routine, but routine brought no peace. Instead, it gave them time to think, to question, to confront the collapse of everything they had been taught. Keiko found herself having imaginary conversations with her father. He had been a loyal supporter of the empire, had sent her off to work for the military with pride. What would he say if he saw her now, filing American papers, eating American food, sleeping peacefully in an American camp? Would he be ashamed? Would he understand? Could she even explain it to him? She wrote in her notebook, "I was raised to believe in the superiority of our people, our cause, our destiny. I was told the Americans were demons, less than human, incapable of honor or mercy. Every day here proves those teachings were lies. But if that was a lie, what else was? How much of my life was built on deception?" Yuki struggled differently. Her medical training had always emphasized evidence, observation, empirical truth. Now that training was forcing her to acknowledge what she saw every day in the hospital. The American medical system was efficient, well-supplied, and dedicated to healing. The doctors and nurses worked with skill and care. They treated prisoners with the same attention they gave their own soldiers. The supplies were abundant, the equipment modern, the procedures effective. Everything she had been told about American backwardness and barbarism was demonstrably false. One day she helped treat a German prisoner who had attempted suicide. The American doctor worked for over an hour to stabilize him, using resources and time to save the life of a man who had fought against America. Afterwards, sitting in the break room, the doctor explained to Yuki through the translator, "He's a human being." The doctor said simply, "That's all that matters in here. Whatever he did out there, in here, he's just a patient who needs help." Yuki thought about this for days, the radical simplicity of it. The revolutionary idea that a person's humanity could transcend their nationality, their actions, their allegiances. In Japan, she had watched wounded soldiers being left to die because resources were scarce, and some lives were deemed more valuable than others. She had seen prisoners executed rather than treated. She had participated in a system that ranked human worth. And here was an enemy doctor who apparently didn't. The women began talking more openly about their confusion. At night after lights out, whispered conversations traveled through the dark barracks. "Do you think our government lied to us?" someone asked. "Not lied," another replied carefully. "Maybe they didn't know. Maybe they believed it themselves. Or maybe," a third voice said quietly, "they knew exactly what they were doing. Maybe the lies were necessary to keep us fighting." These conversations were dangerous, treasonous even, But here in this strange liminal space, thousands of miles from home and everything they knew, the women found they could speak truths they had never dared voice before. Not everyone participated. Some women clung fiercely to their old beliefs, insisting that American kindness was manipulation, that punishment would come eventually, that loyalty to the emperor was still paramount. These women kept to themselves, eating their meals in silence, refusing to engage with the contradictions. But others, like Keiko and Yuki, found they couldn't look away from the evidence before them. The cognitive dissonance was painful, but it was also clarifying. Each day forced them to choose, believe their own eyes or cling to propaganda that made less sense with every passing hour. 3 months in, something shifted. The women began to recognize a disturbing truth. America's greatest weapon was not its bombs or its armies. It was this: the food, the medicine, the casual assumption that even prisoners deserved basic dignity. By treating them humanely, America was demonstrating the bankruptcy of everything they had been taught. Every meal was an indictment. Every clean bed was evidence of empire's failure. Every moment of decent treatment undermined the entire ideological structure they had built their lives around. Keiko articulated it one evening, speaking to a small group gathered in the yard. "They don't need to torture us," she said slowly. "The kindness is more effective. How can we believe we were fighting for civilization against barbarians when the barbarians give us chocolate and the civilization let our families starve?" The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. She had spoken what they all felt. Yuki added, "In the hospital, I see American values every day. They spend resources to heal. They treat all patients equally. They believe in the value of life, even enemy life. Whatever else America is, it's not what we were told." "But what does that mean for us?" another woman asked, her voice breaking. "If everything we believed was wrong, who are we? What do we stand for?" These questions hung in the air, unanswerable but unavoidable. Hana, the young Korean woman who rarely spoke, surprised everyone by answering. "Maybe," she said softly. "We don't need to stand for anything anymore. Maybe we just need to survive, to learn, to remember." Her words carried a weight that silenced further discussion. Survive, learn, remember. Perhaps that was enough. As the women spent more time in the camp, they began to observe American culture more closely. They saw things that both fascinated and confused them. The Americans seemed to have no shame about displaying affection. Soldiers kissed their girlfriends goodbye openly. People hugged casually. There was a physical ease that felt foreign to women raised in a culture of formality and restraint. The Americans also seemed obsessed with efficiency and fairness. Everything was scheduled, organized, distributed according to rules. Even the prisoners had rights, written down and enforced. It was a system, impersonal perhaps, but consistent. One day, Keiko witnessed an argument between an American private and a sergeant. The private was angry about something, and he spoke to the sergeant with a directness that would have been unthinkable in the Japanese military. The sergeant listened, then explained his decision. The private didn't agree, but he saluted and followed orders. Keiko was stunned. A subordinate had questioned a superior, and instead of punishment, there had been discussion. The hierarchy existed, but it seemed less absolute, less brutal. She mentioned this to Yuki later. Yuki nodded thoughtfully. "I've noticed that too. In the hospital, the nurses question the doctors sometimes. Not disrespectfully, but they ask why and expect answers. It's like everyone is expected to think, not just obey." These observations accumulated, building a picture of a society fundamentally different from their own. Not better or worse, necessarily, but operating on different principles. Principles that seemed to value individual worth alongside collective goals. It was disorienting. Everything they had been taught said their way was superior, but the evidence suggested something more complicated. The transformation was not complete. Many women still struggled, still clung to old beliefs, still hoped to return to Japan and resume their previous lives. But cracks had formed in the foundation. Questions had been asked that couldn't be unasked, and in those cracks something new was beginning to grow. 4 months into their captivity, in January 1946, everything came to a head because of a woman named Tomoko. Tomoko was 42, older than most of the other women. She had been a teacher before the war, recruited to work as a clerk in a military office in the Philippines. She was quiet, dignified, and deeply traditional. She had maintained her reserve throughout their captivity, neither accepting nor rejecting the situation, simply enduring it with stoic patience. In early January, Tomoko fell ill. At first, it seemed like a simple cold. She coughed, ran a slight fever, continued working. But within days, her condition deteriorated rapidly. The fever spiked. She became delirious. Her breathing turned labored. Yuki recognized the symptoms immediately. Pneumonia and severe. Tomoko was moved to the infirmary, but there were no beds available. The flu had been sweeping through the camp, and the medical ward was full. Tomoko was placed on a mattress on the floor in a corner of the ward, a thin blanket pulled over her shaking body. The other Japanese women came to visit when they could. They knelt beside her on the floor, holding her hand, speaking soft words of comfort. Tomoko barely responded. Her breathing was shallow, her skin burning hot. "She's dying," Yuki told Keiko quietly. They stood outside the infirmary, looking through the window at Tomoko's still form on the floor. "Without proper treatment, antibiotics, oxygen, she won't last the week." "Will they treat her?" Keiko asked. "She's just a prisoner. Will they waste medicine on her?" Yuki didn't answer. She didn't know. The next morning, Dr. Harrison, the chief medical officer, made his rounds. He was a stern man in his 50s, a career military doctor who ran the infirmary with rigid efficiency. The Japanese women had seen him from a distance but had few direct interactions with him. When Dr. Harrison saw Tomoko on the floor, he stopped. He knelt down, checked her pulse, listened to her labored breathing. Then he stood and called for the nurses. "Get me a bed," he ordered. "Clear one if you have to, and start her on penicillin immediately. I want oxygen ready and IV fluids. Move." The nurses scrambled to obey. Within minutes, a bed was being cleared, a soldier with a minor injury being moved to a chair to make room. Dr. Harrison turned to the Japanese women who had gathered near Tomoko. Through the translator, he spoke directly to them. "I need help moving her. The nurse is getting supplies. You, the one with medical training," he pointed at Yuki. "Help me lift her. Carefully support her head and back." What happened next was seared into the memory of every woman present. Dr. Harrison, this American doctor, this representative of the enemy, bent down and gently slid his arms under Tomoko's frail body. Yuki moved to support her from the other side. Together they lifted her carefully, Dr. Harrison taking most of the weight, his face set in concentration. He carried her across the ward and laid her gently on the freshly prepared bed. He adjusted her head on the pillow, pulled the blanket up, checked her pulse again. His movements were practiced, professional, but also unmistakably gentle. The entire ward had fallen silent. Everyone was watching. American soldiers, German prisoners, the Japanese women, all staring at this scene, and then someone began to sob. It was Keiko. She stood with both hands pressed to her mouth, tears streaming down her face. The sound broke whatever dam had been holding back the other women's emotions. One by one they began to cry. Not quiet tears, but deep, racking sobs that shook their whole bodies. Dr. Harrison looked up, clearly confused by this response. He glanced at the translator, who seemed equally at a loss. "What's wrong?" he asked. "What did I do?" Yuki tried to explain, but her own voice was choked with tears. You lifted her. You touched her. You carried her like she mattered." Dr. Harrison frowned. "Of course I did. She's my patient. Now please step back so I can work." He turned back to Tomoko, beginning treatment as if nothing unusual had happened. But for the Japanese women, everything had changed. That night the barracks was filled with intense, whispered conversation. The women couldn't stop talking about what they had witnessed. "He touched her," someone kept repeating. "He put his hands on her, lifted her, carried her. An enemy woman, dying, worthless to him, and he carried her like she was precious." "Of course he did," another replied. "To him, she's not an enemy. She's a person who needs help. That's what we saw. That's what they believe." Keiko sat on her bed, still shaken. She had been changing gradually over the months, her certainties eroding bit by bit, but this moment had shattered something fundamental. She took out her notebook and wrote, her hand trembling. "Today I watched an American doctor carry a dying Japanese woman to a clean bed. He used his own hands. He didn't hesitate. He didn't show disgust. He simply did what needed to be done because she was a human being who required care. In Japan, I watched wounded soldiers left to die in hallways because there weren't enough resources and some lives were worth more than others. I watched prisoners executed rather than treated. I participated in a system that assigned value to human life based on nationality and utility. And now I have seen the enemy demonstrate a different value system, one that says a person is a person regardless of everything else. I don't know what to do with this knowledge. It hurts too much. It changes too much. But I cannot unknow it. I cannot pretend I didn't see what I saw. My entire worldview has been built on lies, and I don't know how to rebuild it." Around her, other women were having similar reckonings. Years of propaganda, of teaching, of certainty were collapsing under the weight of one simple act of human decency. Over the next week, Tomoko slowly improved. The penicillin fought the infection. The oxygen eased her breathing. Dr. Harrison checked on her daily, adjusting her treatment, monitoring her progress with the same careful attention he gave all his patients. The Japanese women visited whenever allowed. They sat beside her bed, held her hand, whispered encouragement, and they watched the American medical staff work with something approaching awe. Yuki was allowed to assist with Tomoko's care. She learned to administer the IV medications, to check vital signs, to adjust the oxygen flow. Dr. Harrison taught her patiently, explaining each procedure. "Why?" she finally asked him one day. Why do you teach me? Why do you save her? We are your enemies." Dr. Harrison looked at her for a long moment. Then he spoke slowly, waiting for the translator to catch up. "The war is over. In here, in this hospital, there are no enemies. There are only patients and healers. That's all. I teach you because you want to learn and because you're good at this. I save her because that's my job and because every life has value. It's really that simple." He paused, then added, "I know what you were taught about us. I know what propaganda does. But I hope you'll judge us by what you see, not what you were told. That's all I ask." Yuki bowed deeply, tears sliding down her face. When she straightened, she said in halting English practiced in secret for weeks, "Thank you. I see. I understand." Dr. Harrison nodded and went back to his work, leaving Yuki standing there, transformed. When Tomoko was finally well enough to return to the barracks, 3 weeks after falling ill, she was a different woman. Not just physically stronger, but changed in some fundamental way. She had been cared for, had felt the value placed on her life, had experienced mercy from those she had been taught to hate. The night she returned, the women gathered around her bed. She spoke quietly, her voice still weak. "When I was lying on that floor, burning with fever, I prayed for death," she said. "I thought it would be easier. But he picked me up. He carried me as though I weighed nothing, as though I mattered. And in that moment I understood that I had been wrong about everything." She looked around at the women, tears in her eyes. "We were told we were superior, that our way was the only way, that the enemy was less than human. But I have been shown more humanity by the enemy than I ever received from those who claimed to care for me. What does that mean? What do we do with that truth?" The women had no answers, but they didn't need answers anymore. They needed to acknowledge what had happened, to bear witness to their transformation, to accept that they could never go back to who they had been before. The war was over, but for these women a new kind of battle had just begun. The battle to reconcile two realities, to build new identities from the ruins of old certainties, to learn how to live in a world more complicated than they had ever imagined. The months following Tomoko's recovery were different. The women continued their routines, continued their work, continued living in the strange space between captivity and care, but something fundamental had shifted. They no longer spent their energy waiting for cruelty to begin. They accepted that this was how it would be. Meals, work, medical care, small freedoms. They were prisoners, yes, but treated with a baseline of dignity that contradicted everything they had been taught to expect. Keiko became more proficient at her office work. She learned some English, enough to understand basic instructions and even make small talk with the American clerks. One of them, a young woman named Betty, began bringing her magazines, teaching her American idioms, treating her like a colleague rather than an enemy. "You know," Betty said one day, "you're not what I expected. When they told us we'd be working with Japanese prisoners, I thought... I don't know what I thought. But you're just people. Just women trying to get through this." Keiko smiled sadly. "Yes, just people. We are learning this too." Yuki continued working in the hospital, her skills improving daily under Dr. Harrison's tutelage. She was trusted with more responsibilities, allowed to work more independently. The other nurses accepted her presence, even sought her opinion on some cases. It felt like being a real nurse again. It felt like having purpose. But the guilt never fully disappeared. Every moment of satisfaction was shadowed by thoughts of home, of family suffering while she lived in relative comfort. The contradiction was inescapable. In the spring of 1946, news came that they would be returned to Japan. The announcement caused mixed reactions among the women. Relief, certainly, the prospect of reuniting with families, of going home. But also fear. What would they find? What would they return to? And underneath those practical concerns ran a deeper anxiety. How would they explain what had happened to them? How would they describe their treatment? Would they be believed? Would they be condemned for adapting, for surviving, for working alongside the enemy? "I'm afraid to go back," Keiko admitted one night. "Not because I want to stay here, but because I don't know who I am anymore. The person who left Japan doesn't exist. The person going back is someone different." Many women shared this feeling. They had been changed by this experience in ways they couldn't fully articulate. They had seen their enemies be more humane than their own leaders. They had received mercy when they expected cruelty. They had learned that the world was more complex than propaganda allowed. How do you return to simplicity after complexity? How do you unknow what you've learned? The last week at Fort McClellan was strange. The women packed their few belongings, said goodbye to the places that had become familiar. The barracks that had sheltered them, the mess hall where they had learned to eat without fear, the offices and workspaces where they had found purpose. Some of the American staff seemed genuinely sorry to see them go. Betty gave Keiko a small photo of them together, taken one afternoon in the office. "Remember me," Betty said. "Remember that we can be friends, even after everything. Dr. Harrison called Yuki into his office on her last day. He handed her a letter of recommendation, written in English. "You're a good nurse," he said through the translator. "Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. Don't let what happened to your country make you forget your own skills and value. You saved lives here. You can save lives there. Medicine is medicine regardless of politics." Yuki took the letter with shaking hands. "I will never forget," she said, "what you taught me, what you showed me. I will try to be worthy of it." The day of departure arrived. The women were loaded onto buses, then trains, retracing the journey they had made months before. But they were different travelers now. They had arrived terrified, convinced they were heading toward death. They left confused, grateful, and fundamentally changed. The ship that took them back to Japan was crowded with returning prisoners and displaced persons. The women stayed together, a unit bound by shared experience. They talked endlessly about what they would find, what they would say, how they would explain. When the Japanese coast finally appeared on the horizon, many women began to cry. Home. After everything, they were going home. But the Japan they returned to was unrecognizable. The ship docked at Yokohama, and the women stared in horror at what had become of their country. Entire neighborhoods were gone, reduced to ash and rubble. Survivors moved through the ruins like ghosts, their faces hollow with hunger and despair. The contrast with America's abundance was obscene. The women had known intellectually that Japan was destroyed. But seeing it, smelling the ash, hearing the silence where cities should have been alive with sound, it broke something in them. They were processed through a repatriation center, given small amounts of money, and released to find their own way home. Many had no homes to return to. Families had been scattered, addresses no longer existed, entire communities had been erased. Keiko searched for 2 weeks before she found her mother, living in a refugee camp on the outskirts of Tokyo. When they finally saw each other, they fell into each other's arms, both crying too hard to speak. Later, when they could talk, her mother asked, "Where were you? What happened?" Keiko tried to explain. "I was in America. I was a prisoner. They treated us well. They gave us food, medicine, work. They didn't hurt us." Her mother stared at her, struggling to understand. "The Americans? They were kind to you?" "Yes," Keiko said quietly. "They were kind, and I don't know how to feel about that. We were enemies. They destroyed our country, but they treated me with more dignity than I had any right to expect." Her mother held her hand tightly. "Then you were lucky," she said finally. "You survived. That's what matters. You can sort out the rest later." Decades passed. The women who had been prisoners at Fort McClellan scattered across rebuilt Japan, making lives for themselves in the new reality. Some never spoke of their experience. Others told carefully edited versions, leaving out the parts that didn't fit the expected narrative. Yuki became a nurse again, working in a Tokyo hospital. She used the skills Dr. Harrison had taught her, implementing American medical procedures, advocating for patient-centered care. When colleagues asked where she learned such techniques, she told them. Most didn't believe her. Keiko became a teacher, like Tomoko had been before the war. She taught her students about the importance of looking beyond propaganda, of judging people by their actions rather than their nationality. She never explicitly told them about Fort McClellan, but the lessons she had learned there informed everything she taught. In 1985, 40 years after the war's end, several of the former prisoners organized a reunion. 12 of them managed to attend, elderly women now, gathering in a small restaurant in Osaka. They shared memories, filling in gaps, comparing notes on what had become of their lives, and they talked about the experience that had defined them. "Do you remember when Dr. Harrison carried Tomoko?" someone asked. Everyone nodded. Of course they remembered. It was the moment everything changed. Tomoko, now in her 80s but still sharp, spoke quietly. "I've thought about that moment every day of my life since. Not because it was extraordinary, but because it shouldn't have been. Basic human decency shouldn't feel like a miracle, but it did, because we had been taught to expect so much less." She paused, then continued. "I think that's what I want people to understand. Not that the Americans were perfect. They weren't. They had destroyed our cities, killed millions, occupied our country. But in that moment, in that hospital, they showed me that enemies can still recognize each other's humanity, and that recognition can change everything." The women sat in silence, reflecting on this truth. They had lived it, they had been changed by it, and in their own small ways, they had spent the rest of their lives trying to pass that lesson forward. And so a simple medical table in an Alabama camp became the site of a quiet revolution. Not the kind that makes history books, but the kind that changes individual hearts. For 47 Japanese women, that moment when Dr. Harrison lifted their dying friend proved that everything they had been taught could be wrong, that enemies could show mercy, and that humanity could transcend nationality. The war had been fought with bombs and bullets, but for these women, the real transformation happened in mess halls and hospitals, in moments of unexpected kindness and uncomfortable recognition. They learned that propaganda could lie, that governments could manipulate, and that the truth was always more complex than anyone wanted to admit. Years later, Keiko wrote one final entry in her old notebook, the one she had kept throughout her captivity and carried home to Japan. We expected cruelty and received care. We expected hatred and received indifference, which was somehow better. We expected to be treated as less than human, and instead were shown that humanity exists even between enemies. The Americans didn't just defeat us with their weapons. They defeated our ideology with soap and medicine and clean beds and one doctor's decision to carry a dying woman to a hospital bed. That gesture changed more than their war machines ever could. It changed us. And we could never go back to who we were before. The story of these women is not widely known. It doesn't fit neatly into narratives of heroes and villains. But it's a story worth remembering because it reminds us that in the midst of history's greatest violence, small acts of decency can crack open the hardest hearts. Sometimes mercy is more powerful than cruelty. Sometimes kindness is the most effective weapon. And sometimes the hardest truths to accept are the ones that force us to question everything we thought we knew. If this story moved you, please like this video and subscribe to our channel. There are thousands of untold stories from World War II, human stories that complicate our understanding of war, peace, and what it means to be human. These stories deserve to be remembered and shared. Thank you for listening.